Should you stretch for proximal hamstring tendinopathy? If you've seen anything on the internet, you're probably thinking the answer is no, you shouldn't stretch proximal hamstring tendinopathy. Why does this video even exist? Well, in this video we're actually going to discuss compressive loading and why something like stretching is actually needed for the recovery process in proximal hamstring tendinopathy. So let's start off by talking about why the common recommendation for proximal hamstring tendinopathy is to avoid stretching. And the reason is because when we look at the anatomy, we have the ischial tuberosity on the bottom, and then the proximal hamstring attaches onto that. And when we're in a flexed position, it's going to cause compression between the tendon and that ischial tuberosity. So if we're sitting, bending over, anything that involves hip flexion, which is most hamstring stretches, that's going to compress the tendon against the bone, and generally that leads to irritation for those who are experiencing proximal hamstring tendinopathy, especially when it's in a highly irritated state. But the problem is that if we avoid these compressive loads for too long, then the tendon isn't able to adapt to those loads that we experience in day-to-day activities, such as sitting, bending over to pick something off of the ground, tying our shoes, or doing various workouts. And in fact, the tendon can become worse at actually tolerating these compressive loads through something called stress shielding, and that's because we're just not exposing the tendon to those compressive loads. The example I commonly give is public speaking. Let's say we're absolutely terrified of public speaking. Well, we know that to get better at public speaking, you have to practice a little bit. And obviously in the beginning, we're not going to sign up for a TED Talk and give a presentation in front of thousands of people, and that's going to help us magically conquer our fear of public speaking. But we'll start on a much smaller scale, so maybe we'll talk to a couple of friends and a couple of coworkers that we trust. Then we move on to presenting to a little bit bigger of a team, and then to an even larger presentation. And this approach is similar to what we would do for something like proximal hamstring tendinopathy and increasing our tolerance to stretching and compressive loads. We have to start small and then kind of build our way up until we're able to do whatever we want to do. We might start with something like a quadruped rock to start exposing the hamstring tendon to a little bit of compressive load. So what we'll do is we'll just slowly rock our hips back towards our feet and then come back up. And so if we have a really sensitive tendon, we might start in a little bit more of an extended position in the hip, and maybe we don't go down as far, but our goal is just to slowly go through this range of motion to add compressive load to the tendon. A couple of variations that we can do is that we can actually hold this bottom position, so we're actually treating it a little bit more of a stretch than just kind of a gentle mobilization. The other thing that we can do is we can go into some circles here, which will just expose the tendon to a little bit larger range of motion here. Another low load variation that we can do is an extender exercise, where we'll start to expose the hamstring tendon to a little bit of hip flexion with some knee extension. So this will look more like a traditional hamstring stretch. So the further we bring the hip into flexion, the more challenging the exercise is going to be for that hamstring tendon. And so what we'll do is we'll just hold back behind the knee, and then we'll just slowly extend our leg up as far as we can go, and then come back down. And then the variation is just to bring that hip up into a little bit more flexion, and then again extend the knee, and then slowly come back down. To further increase the load, we can progress to something like a split squat, where we're going to be working on this front leg here. And so what we'll do is we'll just slowly lower ourselves down towards the ground and then come back up. And so if we're dealing with a sensitive tendon that's still not able to tolerate this amount of hip flexion here, then we could just use something like a mini split squat, where we'll go down just a little bit and then come back up, and then just slowly work ourselves further and further down until we're able to go through that full range of motion. And then finally we can progress to something like a hip hinge or a deadlift to keep increasing the challenge on that proximal hamstring. And so for the hip hinge, what we'll do is we're going to flex through the hips. So we're going to pretend that we're pushing our hips back towards the wall behind us and then coming back up. And so basically when we're just loading it, that's called a deadlift. So what we'll do is we'll take a weight, it could be a kettlebell, a barbell, whatever you have available to you, and then practice that same range of motion, just loading that tendon into a little bit of compression at the bottom here. There are also some single leg variations that we can progress to. So on this variation, I'm going to be working on my right leg here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to flex through my hip and then come back up. And so if we need to, we can use a wall for balance, or if we're able to balance, we can just do it freestanding. And so essentially this is the same as the hip hinge, where we're just trying to move through this hip and bring the hip into flexion and then extension. Now, do we have to immediately add stretching and compressive loading in a rehab program for proximal hamstring tendinopathy? Of course not. If we have a really sensitive tendon that's not able to tolerate a lot of hip flexion, then we're probably going to start with the hip more in a neutral position and start loading from there. But eventually we need to expose the tendon to those compressive loads through hip flexion so that it's better able to tolerate it. And when we choose to start incorporating compressive loading really varies between individuals. For some, we might need to spend a little bit more time loading with the hip in neutral before we're able to progress to other exercises. And for some, we might be able to progress relatively quickly and start incorporating those compressive loads and stretching. But the key is that we're not spending long periods of time avoiding compressive loading and then wondering why, when we start to add a little bit of compression through our normal day-to-day activities, why it's not able to tolerate those forces. And this is especially relevant for when we look at chronic proximal hamstring tendinopathy, where we start to see a lot of fear of flexing the hip and adding compression. At some point, we need to start exposing that tendon to those compressive loads so that we can get back to our normal day-to-day activities without pain. Hopefully this video was helpful if you're dealing with proximal hamstring tendinopathy. I tend to see a lot of fear around stretching and compressive loading, so hopefully this video provides a little bit of context which can help in the recovery process. So if it did, go ahead and give this video a big thumbs up. It'll help other people that are dealing with proximal hamstring tendinopathy find this video. If you want to support the channel, hit the subscribe button over to the side here. Leave me a comment below with any questions that you might have. I'll see you guys in the next video.